And thank you everyone, it's a real privilege to be here. On my second or third day of arriving in Sri Lanka, I had seen on Twitter that Devika was giving his talk, which was the second of the SSA seminars, and kind of through the engagement in the connection that I've kind of been able to build with people from SSA has really had a profound impact on my research. It's, I think, actually shaped the research as well towards some of the agrarian study teacher as well, particularly Sri Lanka. So I'm really thankful to be here. I'm kind of now towards the end of my, unfortunately getting towards the end of my field work. I've been here for almost 8 months. And so I'm going to present some of my initial kind of thoughts and findings. They're a little bit incoherent, but that kind of gives you an insight to some of the incoherence in my mind as well, so you get a little... but what I would do is also encourage you, as we go along, if you have any questions, or you have any concerns, or anything like that, I mean, think critically about the work that I'm doing, and don't be afraid to ask critical questions as well. I would really appreciate that type of feedback as we go. So, yeah, as of course, it's my PhD is broadly looking at the political ecologies of climate change, water infrastructure, and rural development. And so today I'm going to kind of spend a little bit of time just briefly introducing kind of political ecology, what that is, and climate politics, why I think that matters, and some of the engagements with critical agrarian studies. I'm then going to actually kind of give a bit of a broader brief introduction to climate politics in Sri Lanka, and as a result of some of the fear that I thought I didn't have enough to talk about, I'm going to draw a little bit on some of my master's research I did here in 2019 in civil economy, which looks, I think that speaks a bit more closely to some of the work, critical agrarian studies work that's been going on within the SSA. And then I'll kind of move on to some of my more recent work before having a bit of a discussion around, working towards a kind of more progressive agrarian climate politics. Excellent. So, first, I suppose to start off with, what is political ecology? And it's not a theory of such. It draws on theories, and there's a number of kind of emerged in kind of the late 70s, 80s, really, through kind of engagements with kind of concerns around the environment, also from more of a Marxist political economy standpoint, but it's now most certainly developed into kind of a very wide school of thought. And what kind of really brings this broad school of thought and field of practice together is concerns about the relationship between nature, society, and social power. So, at the heart of a lot of what we do as political ecologists is we kind of challenge what we say is this kind of modern conception of the separation from nature and society. And so, particularly in the time of the Anthropocene, we would say that there's no such thing as any more of a pristine nature that's out there. But in fact, nature-society relationships are produced through social political power relationships. So, we kind of particularly would challenge some of the political neutral discussions around and descriptions around the environment, nature, and climate. And I kind of want to put these two quotes in here, which I think hopefully will be useful as we kind of move forward. And the first is by Maria Kaka, who says that science produces knowledge, but the way this knowledge is put into practice is always and can only be a political question. So, and it's similar to Bruno Latour also talked about we have matters of fact, but how to become matters of concern again is something political. So we know, for example, human-induced climate change is a matter of fact, but how that kind of becomes put into practice is a political question. So when we talk about like climate politics, and I'll get to that as well, it's not to kind of give room for climate denialism, but it's actually how we understand climate, how we define, how we respond to it is a political question. So, excellent. So in political ecology, often, I think, resonates with a lot of the work for critical agrarian studies is there are often stories around justice, injustice, and broadly some of the questions we might look at would be, how are social ecological relations and configurations co-produced over space and time? What are the power relations involved in this? Who wins and loses through these processes? And that's kind of a classic, but also important is not just identifying inequality, but actually why people, why certain social groups win and lose. And that draws you kind of towards analysis more than some of the historical processes, kind of political economic configurations, some of these social assumptions and discourses that make over time kind of life more unjust for certain people. And so we'd kind of take issue with some of the more neoliberal ideas of, say, scarcity, for example. So like with kind of a neoliberal economic framework, we'd say like resources as scarce, and so we have to manage them as efficiently as possible. Whereas, not to discount that, but for political politics, okay, why is there scarcity in the first place? And I mean, very briefly, because I'll keep on moving on, but like an example would be from my country in Australia. We have the Murray-Darling Basin, which is a very big river basin in Australia. It connects to the Murray River, which is Australia's longest river. Farmers at the bottom of there often experience concerns of water scarcity. And so there's the idea that, well, we need to actually start managing the water in a more efficient way. But actually, at the top of the river basin, there is a number of water rights which have been sold to multinational companies who then produce cotton, a really water-intensive crop. So when we start looking at it more broadly, we can see actually water scarcity itself there is not just natural, but it's social, political, kind of economic thing as well. So we start to kind of look at these broader, what happens kind of at the individual level is always linked to different scales and to politics. So, and so, move on. So as I said, so when we talk about climate politics, it's not to say that there's climate denialism, but we think of it how climate is kind of understood and applied as something that's political. So I mean, prominent framings of climate change, for understanding the effects of climate change, are primarily focused on biophysical climate effects, and in the process silencing the political, economic, non-climatic kind of social, economic dynamics that shape the effects of climate change and shape our responses to climate change. And so the kind of externalization of climate change is something that's external, as the idea of climate change as an external biophysical threat tends to leave the space of climate change, at least more prominently, to our colleagues in biophysical sciences who do an excellent, absolutely a fantastic job, but we also need to have some critical social scientists need to be involved in that too, to kind of focus on some of the politics. So there's the idea that climate change is something that's externalized and society must then adapt to or become resilient to the external threats of climate change. And so for political ecologists, we would say that this tends to reduce climate change to something that's like more technical and a depoliticized problem. And I will kind of get back to this idea of a problem towards the end. And so once a technical problem, we kind of get into what we might call what I would call this resilience heuristic, which is a process of identifying the problems. That might be drought, for example, and then identifying a range of technical solutions, so climate resilient hybrid seeds, or more climate resilient, so climate smart agricultural practices. And so we have this idea of kind of technical fixes, which, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of jumping between the two here. Technical, so the point I wanted to say is that by going through this process there is this emphasis within kind of climate literature and some of the more prominent climate responses for looking towards climate, or what we call technical fixes, which essentially work inside the bounds of the political economic system without questioning the political economic system. So we'd call it like applying a band-aid or something like this, or applying a bandage to a system. And there's this increasing understanding and call to kind of transform, in the face of climate change, transform the political economic systems that we live in that are producing climate change and injustice, but the majority of kind of the responses that are in policy and kind of international development project level tend to focus on working within the bounds of the political economic system, which, as I will start to show, have undermined some of the resilience of small-scale farmers, if that makes sense. So I hope that was not too rambling. And so climate politics here, I'm going to take this definition from Joan Boris and a number of other prominent critical agrarian studies scholars here, which talk about the overlapping social, institutional, and political dynamics that shape the meanings of climate change, its causes and consequences, how it can be addressed, by whom, where and when. So these are very political questions, and we can see the questions that kind of follow after that are again kind of draw our attention to some of the politics around climate change. that I wanted to, that I hope will kind of become clear as the talk goes on. So who gets to imagine what climate change futures will look like, what are the material implications of these imaginations, resilience to what and for whom, kind of who wins through these processes, who loses, and how do certain ideas of climate change futures, certain ideas of climate resilience become reality while others become silenced and foreclosed. So political ecology and climate politics and critical agrarian studies I see working overlapping in many ways. And so there's quite a large body of critical climate change adaptation literature which illustrates that while climate change is obviously affecting the lives of small-scale farmers around the world, the climate change interventions risk of being irrelevant to agricultural households if the relationship with the wider cultural, socioeconomic, political processes are not considered adequately. So prominent scientific framings that shape climate change intervention policy often begin by trying to understand the biophysical effects of climate change, and through this lens approach agrarian lives, vulnerabilities through the terms of, basically approach and see climate agrarian lives through biophysical risk or vulnerability or adaptive capacity. And while these are important, I would argue that actually what they produce is an ahistorical and apolitical understanding of agrarian societies and how these vulnerabilities are produced. So what, kind of drawing on some of the work from critical agrarian studies, what I would like to do in my research is to kind of essentially work backwards from that stage. Rather than starting with trying to understand the biophysical risk, understanding situated agrarian politics and the micropolitics at the local level, and how that then shapes how climate change is experienced, and also how responses to climate change are kind of experienced as well. And so I think doing so also helps to understand how and why climate change responses unevenly affect agrarian communities, and also why some win, why some loses. And I also, I hope this can, while it's still a very undeveloped idea, just to get to think beyond, how something beyond kind of technical fixes to climate change. And so the argument that I'm trying to put forward here is that climate change, climate politics is shaped by, and in turn shapes the politics trajectories of agrarian change. And the other point I also want to say here as well is that in agrarian politics, climate politics, you wouldn't say that they're reducible to each other, but they're becoming increasingly inseparable. And I think it's now important to talk about, when we talk about agrarian politics, is perhaps talk about climate changing or climate change agrarian politics. So quickly to kind of move on, I'll just quickly touch on this. Basically, I'm drawing predominantly on 8 months of qualitative research, which I'm currently wrapping up. And that was conducted in the village, 4 months that was conducted in the village of Palawapatana, where we interviewed a range of small-scale farmers, key informants from the government, the UNDP, World Bank, and big organisations, as well as a little bit of work with MONLA, with Agriculture and Land Reform, who are an excellent activist group. And I haven't been working on any of the archival research I'm doing at the moment. I haven't had a chance, but that's basically I'm trying to understand some of the colonial continuities that have shaped the North Central dry zone, and also have shaped the vulnerabilities and kind of contemporary power relations within there. I'm also drawing very briefly on a little bit of research I did in 2019 because I felt that I might need to fill some gaps, but I'm also hoping that I haven't tried to do too much. We'll see. But just very quickly, I think we're all aware climate change is a really big issue within the dry zone. I'm not going to spend too much time going through there. There are some links at the bottom which this can be shared, and by all means please go through. But I think a couple of things to point out within the North Central dry zone, particularly, it's predicted that over time, under both high emissions and low emissions scenarios, that rainfall will start to decrease within the North Central area of Sri Lanka. But not only is it decreasing, the extreme days of rainfall are also increasing. So basically we're getting the same amount of rainfall or less rainfall in a shorter period of time. And I think the second point here is quite revealing, quite interesting, is that between 1980 and 1999, the average kind of maximum one-day rainfall was around 73 73 millimeters. That's actually gone up from 2010 to 2015 to around 135 millimeters. Now that's basically double, but if we also then look at the average rainfall for this area, that's kind of doubled to almost 1/10 of the rainfall within 1 day, or so 1/10 of the annual yearly rainfall within 1 day. And so during my research in Palawal-Patana, this was a big issue where first rainfall became less predictable, so that affected planting dates and cultivation dates. Second, there was increasingly extreme rainfall events that was having a big effect on people's on crops and harvest. So they were kind of the two main things. Obviously, also drought is extreme drought, but this was the rainfall pattern changing was the most prominent change amongst farmers that I spoke with. So very quickly, I mean, when I refer to climate politics here, I'm more coming to that from like an international development standpoint. So when we think about climate financing and a lot of the impact it's having on small-scale farming, I think just to jump back one point is that for a lot of people in the rural areas, I'd almost argue that development projects have a bigger impact on their lives than some of the policies. I mean, there's obviously some nuance within that, but so from that standpoint, so there is essentially a lot of climate funding available, and a really revealing interview I had with someone from the UNDP said at the moment, the current government regime has seen climate change as an opportunity, and they know that ordinary funds are not necessarily available, but they know that that in order to access international support and funding, we have to develop more climate change related projects. So another interview revealed something similar where they talked about climate change funding is available and we can use that. There's opportunities for companies like us in Sri Lanka where we can use that to address other development priorities as well for the government. So I think it's quite important saying that basically the funding bodies, international funding bodies have a lot of power as well to apply for funding. So through the Green Climate Fund, you have to present a very strict climate rationale. And despite how participatory or bottom-up a number of these projects ostensibly put themselves forward, there's also very much there's not a lot of room to maneuver what's kind of the money's given for a certain number of things, and you have to kind of fit within these criteria. So, great. And so, how these projects typically work, I mean, is they start off by looking to kind of demarcate a generalized kind of hotspot of vulnerability, so to speak. So, I mean, the World Bank has a really large project at the moment, the Climate Smart Irrigated Agriculture Project, and they define a climate vulnerability hotspot as a geographical area around 25,000 hectares on average, where farmers and farming livelihoods are highly exposed to vulnerability, exposed and vulnerable to increasing climate variability based on a number of drought and flood, also other socioeconomic indicators as well. I mean, similarly, the UNDP, they both have similar guidelines. And so I think the first point I want to make is that these are not necessarily problematic on their own. I mean, it's important that we identify who is vulnerable. But what they do is they identify who is vulnerable, but they don't identify why people are vulnerable in the first place. I think that second question, the why people are vulnerable, is really, really important. It draws out attention towards sort of the broader agrarian context that shape the effects of climate change and responses to climate change in different ways. And without understanding why people are vulnerable in the first place, these programs risk kind of being irrelevant to the everyday lives of farmers. And a point as well that I want to, that I'll probably repeat a few times throughout, is that identifying inequality is not the same as analysing power, and it is power that shapes the effects and responses to climate change. So it's a point that I think that's really salient and important as we go on. And so how is climate change, actually climate resilience, envisioned within the dry zone? I mean, the World Bank, again on their project, they identify climate resilience as a capacity of agricultural systems to respond to drought and flood by resisting or tolerating the impacts and recovering quickly through integration of adaptation, mitigation, other climate-smart agricultural practices. Now, quite a prominent political ecologist, Michael Watts, who's also done a number of work within the kind of critical agrarian studies space, he describes resilience kind of ironically as a theory of just about anything. And what he means by that is it's a very powerful discourse. We can apply it to something, but what it actually means in practice is quite ambiguous. So we kind of get a bit of a paradox where we can say, okay, this is climate resilient, it must be good. But what it actually means in practice is quite different. And so we can see here, for example, a key performance indicator of the climate-smart irrigated agriculture project is increasing water productivity, a bit vague, increasing agricultural productivity and crop diversification towards high-value cash crops. Now these are things we've probably heard quite a lot before, and I want to contextualise that historically. And there's a lot of words on this, I'm going to apologise in advance, I'll just read out a few of the important bits, is that if we look back, and I mean, we can even, I've got here post-1977 as a placeholder, but actually in the archives, and I've been reading, going back to the colonial time, there was an emphasis on taking advantage of wastelands to be able to produce more, or the colonisation scheme was also about getting rid of the wasteland, and waste was kind of referred to it as something that didn't produce value and exchange value, economic value. So there is this kind of long-running theme here, and so kind of post-1997, there's an excellent article by Shanmugaratnam, who talked about the economic policy and effects on climate change, effects on agriculture, and he kind of characterises a lot of what happened was obviously the reduction of the state, the primacy given to the market, and infrastructure development to support economic growth through the intensification of land, water, and other resources. In 26 to 2016, Mahinda Chintana Vision for New Sri Lanka plan that came out that their vision for agriculture was increased competitiveness through application of modern technologies, improved cultural practices, shifting towards commercial agriculture. And more recently, just quickly, the Sustainable Sri Lanka 2030 Vision Strict Pathway Plan that came out a few years ago, they talk about how the development of kind of urban metropolises will actually encourage a shift away from agriculture toward, and that is seen as kind of a positive thing. I'm not saying whether it's good or bad, but they're trying to shift, but their vision is of shifting small-scale farmers away from agriculture that will no longer become profitable for them towards more large-scale, mechanised, capital-intensive agriculture. And the final point I will say here as well is that there's, between the World Bank and the Department of Agriculture, there's the Agriculture Sector Modernisation Project. It's a massive project that's ongoing through a lot of Sri Lanka. And they cite here that a consensus has recently emerged within the government that the country should capitalise more strategically on the opportunity to diversify the production structure out of low-value cash crops and towards more high-value cash crops and promote exports. And I've highlighted the word consensus here because this kind of consensualisation of agriculture is a deeply depoliticising thing. I mean, consensus according to whom is the answer. So the point of wanting to show this is that when we think about resilience and kind of discourse of resilience historically, we can see a clear linkage between what is being called resilience and agricultural modernisation. And some might say that actually it's just agricultural modernisation repackaged for the climate change era. I mean, not much has changed, but it's now we've got some more climate resilient technologies to add to the mix. Okay, so I'm going to move on quickly. Now this just draws quickly on some research I did during my Masters in 2019 and some published in 2021 an article about this where we discussed this idea of this productivity vulnerability paradox within agricultural modernisation. And there's just three parts that I would like to kind of quickly illustrate. But many farmers we spoke to, they said they were more productive, yet they were increasingly vulnerable as a result of practices, technologies, and the political economic conditions that were put in place to enhance their productivity. So. And so thinking of that, by going back a slide, we're thinking about the new technologies, the shifting towards commercial agriculture, and so on and so forth. And so what that's kind of done is a reliance upon private markets and increasing production costs have underpinned a debt-driven style of agriculture. I mean, it's not that debt-driven agriculture didn't occur before 1997. We know there's a long history of that, but it's exacerbated this. And so one farmer explained to us, even if we do get a good harvest, by the time we repay the loan and interest, we don't have enough money to buy household necessities. And then the second point to raise is that the neoliberalisation, the increased competition that had been promoted as a way of increasing productivity, has also led to the breakdown of some communal norms. I mean, I've done quite a bit of work around the cascade systems, Elangala systems, which there's an increased the government and a number of these projects are trying to develop ways of kind of communal collective management, kind of recommending, so to speak. But and that's approached through in a way of trying to build new institutions, but without really addressing the fact that actually the style of agriculture being promoted is also breaking down these commons, and people are not necessarily as communal as they once were. And then finally, there is also socio-ecological impacts of kind of chemical fertiliser and pesticide overuse. So issues around, farmers were well aware of the fact that they were often using more chemicals than they should. I've been told many times that actually the farmers don't know, they just don't read, but it's not the case. Many farmers said actually we're aware of that. We have to keep using more because otherwise we can't get a good harvest. And so this idea of like this kind of fertiliser treadmill, where you have to keep adding more and more just to kind of keep up. So that was, and then that was obviously leading to issues of like reproducing issues of soil infertility, and kind of in a bit of a kind of a paradoxical, contradictory way. And then finally, obviously there are issues around kind of health-related impacts around chemical fertiliser and pesticide overuse. And these are not only just human health issues, they also have financial issues as well. So I'm going to quickly introduce Kalawapatana, which is the village that I spent most of my time. I spent a good 4 months over the last bit of, recently. So it's located within the Unpack district. Again, agriculture is the main livelihood activity, paddy and chenna, and most farmers here own small acres, like small amounts of land, between 2 to 4 acres, although some even less than half an acre. So very small land holding, most don't have formal deeds or permits, and most people here rely upon sharecropping or undeck. And beyond that, a lot of people in the village, a lot of households in the village also now increasingly rely upon informal daily wage labor work in neighbouring villages, in neighbouring wealthy villages. And this has been going for a while, also relying on employment elsewhere. But basically for a lot of people in the village, a lot of households in the village, agriculture is now not for them a livelihood activity that can support their household throughout the year. And another interesting point of this as well is, so this is actually directly neighbours Quealy, the site of Leach's 1964 book. So there was some interesting kind of links between here as well. So I want to talk a little bit, and I'm sorry if I'm going through this a little bit fast, but I want to talk a little bit about kind of the agrarian politics in Kalawapatana. So there's this debt and land are really central figures and central dynamics within social political power relationships in Kalawapatana and the neighbouring villages. So a little bit repetitive here, I apologise, but like obviously since debt has become an essential livelihood strategy that has emerged through increasing household and agricultural production costs. And taking on more debt obviously means taking on more risk, which in the context of climate change is really salient. And for many people in Kalawapatana, they were already in debt to government banks or to commercial banks, and so they turned to wealthy Mudalali in the neighbouring villages. And so Mudalali, I know there is quite a cultural discussion. I'm going to refer to Mudalali here as the village kind of money lenders. I know there's probably more of a discussion to have around this. It's kind of culturally significant as well. But basically, there are a number of Mudalalis in the neighbouring villages, including in Quealy, who would provide loans, so often at unbelievable rates, so 10% per month, starting from the time that the loan would be paid. So that's 120% per year. And so for a lot of farmers, they was kind of struggling to be able to repay that. And so what's key here is that land is often a guarantee. If you're doing it, for most people in Kalawapatana, if they wanted to get a loan from the Mudalali in the neighbouring village, they would then provide either all or a portion of their land as a guarantee. And so what happened is, in some cases, they were still able to access their land, but if the loan was repaid, then it would be taken off them. In other cases, they lost access to the land and would have to kind of engage in some sharecropping of some sort. Now, again, sharecropping, as I said, it's got like a very long history in Sri Lanka. It's very, and I think we could probably go into this quite a lot, but I want to refer to so in Leach's book, for example, and James Brow, they also have they talk quite a bit about and shared cropping, and for them, they describe it as more of a reciprocal practice between, often a reciprocal practice between family members or between friends. Okay, I would go work on their land and help out they would work on my land, or between family members. And others have talked about it in ways where it's mainly the small, like the poor farmers would actually then go, be tenant farmers on a large piece of land owned by a Mudalawi. In Kalawapatana, what was actually happening was a bit different, and many people were engaging in Ande. One, because perhaps it was a way, and they had to kind of give up some control of their land to the Mudalawi. But often what was happening is, even for the land they did have, they weren't able to afford the production costs. So they would approach the Mudalawi themselves and say, I've got this land, would you like to engage in Ande farming with me? So it was kind of the other way around, if that makes sense. And so in some cases it allowed farmers who were able to, who wouldn't be able to cultivate, and I should say what usually happens, and there have been regulations about this. In Kalawapatana there was seemingly no regulation, but basically it's an agreement where the farmer and Mudalawi will agree on splitting the production costs, also labour time, and then the harvest at the end. And say, for example, if they were able to produce 30 bags of paddy, what was often happening is that the Mudalawi would take 20 bags of paddy, and the farmer themselves would take the 10 bags. That 10 bags was often sometimes not even enough for their family to get through the year for food security wise. So there was kind of been, like, over time there are these I just listed two, but quite important socio-political consequences in Kalawapatana of Ande. And a small share of the harvest leads to small, if any, profits and periods of food insecurity, which is a really big issue in the village. Insufficient profits also lead to a cycle of dependency on Ande and informal loans, getting caught in this cycle where they're unable to get out of, and their only way forward was either to leave farming and looking for work, say, in the armed forces, or to continue this kind of impoverishing pauperization around that's occurring. So over time, the Ande dependency embeds these very unequal social-political hierarchies. And so with that concept, I want to move on slightly. And again, I'm sorry, I'm kind of going through this a bit faster than I thought. I'm just conscious of time. But the kind of agrarian crisis in Kalawapatana is historically produced. And when I mean agrarian crisis, I mean the increasing kind of impoverization of small-scale farmers there who are now either leaving farming entirely or continuing farming but just for subsistence and looking for alternative income, or engaging particularly in daily wage labour work, which in itself is uncertain and often seasonal. So this has kind of been bubbling away and progressing over a number of decades. And so the economic crisis that hit, and also the enduring effects of the fertiliser ban, continue to kind of inflame existing inequalities. And so what that often means, and I keep talking about debt, but such a big issue in Kalawapatana is that, again, many small-scale farmers were forced to take on debt during this time. They weren't able to, during the fertiliser ban, many weren't able to get much of a harvest at all, and if they were engaging in Ande, it meant they really got hardly anything. They had to often take out increasing amounts of debt. And so there's one story that I wanted to just quickly just go through of one of the farmers that we spoke to in Kalawapatana. We spent quite a lot of time with in Kalawapatana, who described just quickly, before the ban, fertiliser was cheaply available from the Agrarian Service Centre. During the ban, we were unable to get a good harvest, many people had to go into debt. And then after the ban, and many people couldn't even cover their production costs, so food security became a big issue after the ban, and fertiliser prices are now really high. And for some people in the village, the cost is too high to be able to afford to cultivate paddy. And Kavinda here, he gives the example of his brother-in-law who lives across the road, who stopped farming entirely and is now entirely reliant on daily wage labour work and driving his tuk. And he owes money to the Mudalawi And the only way these folks were able to repay that loan was to kind of leave agriculture entirely. And so it should be noted that the informal daily wage labour work that farmers are often doing within there is usually within neighbouring villages. Again, it's seasonal. Men often earn 2,500 a day, women 2,000 a day. But women apparently prefer and find work easier because they're cheaper, but also they tend to be better workers apparently. So there is this kind of gender dynamic there as well. But there's so what's kind of happening through there is this shift away from agriculture to even more uncertain, informal forms of employment, which have kind of continued reproducing more and more vulnerability. And so there's a couple of points I want to make here. So the law reform would allow you with economic and political power to navigate the fertiliser ban. I mean, some people were still able to access fertilisers, the soil during the fertiliser ban. They have remained well positioned to consolidate their wealth and power further by controlling lines of credit and the accumulation through the dispossession of indebted farmers' lands. So crises are uneven, and there provides a crisis for some, there's also an opportunity for others. And the key point to make is, so the crises are never neutral, and they're never entirely natural. They're produced and experienced through the kind of historical contemporary relations of power that I've tried to very briefly explain in the lead-up. And so this gets us to this concept that I think is really important when we're thinking about vulnerability, climate change, and agrarian politics, and that is of relational vulnerability. And so the concept of relational vulnerability relational vulnerability refers to how the livelihood security of some is enhanced at the expense of others who are dependent and therefore vulnerable to they're increasingly dependent on the livelihood resource of those who are more wealthy, if that makes sense. So basically, in Kalawapatana, vulnerability is a relational process in which the relative livelihood security and power of some, so what Lars talked about, is linked directly to the dependencies and vulnerabilization of others. So vulnerability here is not a state, it's a process. I think that's an important distinction to make. And so identifying inequalities helps us understand who's vulnerable. It doesn't necessarily tell us why they're vulnerable in the first place. And so when we think about vulnerability, we should be very tuned to the local power, social political power relationships that shape vulnerability as well. So it's never kind of anything that's homogenous in any sense. And excellent. So I want to start. So in 2016-17, there was a severe drought in Kalawapatana. Many people were unable to cultivate. Agricultural daily wage labour work was scarce, and many households experienced food insecurity. So during the most difficult times, that would often involve eating once, sometimes twice a day, usually cassava and maybe some pole sandal. That was the kind of the diet. And so again, to survive, many took out loans they could not afford to repay, and again have lost access to their land. And so climate change, it's kind of filtered through this historically produced uneven political, economic, ecological configuration that affects some more than others. And again, similar to with what we saw during the ongoing economic crisis and the issue of the fertiliser ban, is that it kind of exacerbated some of these relational vulnerability dynamics that have allowed certain people in that region to accumulate larger amounts of land, again at the expense of others who are becoming more and more vulnerable. And so climate change is not simply expressed through things such as crop failures or drought. Climate change and crop failure expressed through existing socio-political relationships related to debt land dependency in Kalawapatana, so they kind of exacerbate a little bit. Okay, and so I know these have kind of been fairly rushed and a little bit incoherent, but again, I'm in the process of trying to make sense of everything as at the moment, but what I've tried to do is to give some kind of brief insights into the kind of messy social, political, agrarian dynamics in Subla and Kalawapatana. And my argument would really be that climate change needs to be viewed and seen from these perspectives. I think, okay, it's important that we look at areas, like, it's important to understand the biophysical climate risk will affect certain areas and how that will. That is by generalizing vulnerability around 250,000 hectares, that doesn't do justice to the kind of everyday socio-political realities of farmers in this anywhere. So again, so climate change, yeah. So I think the point that I want to make clear is that it's really important that for understanding how the effects of climate change and responses to climate change is to understand first the everyday realities of small-scale farmers and rural communities. And by starting from there, we can then work backwards. I think that provides us with a broader picture of the effects of climate change, but also the possible responses to climate change. I've just got a couple more slides. So the kind of the question that when I was in Kalavapatana, that I kept thinking about so often was this, there's always glossy reports and projects about enhancing climate resilience by, we're building new infrastructure for this, we're doing this new kind of climate science agricultural program, and by all means, some of these interventions are really welcomed by farmers. I mean, the rehabilitation of the village tanks is something that, for farmers, they really, really appreciate and they really, really want to. So it's not to, I think, coming at something critically is not something good or bad, it's always much more nuanced than that. But yeah, the important question to think of is resilience to what and for whom. And I mean, if it's about coping and bouncing back, for agricultural systems kind of to deal with external climate change threats, what are small-scale farmers in Kalavapatana bouncing back to? The current social ecological configuration for many small-scale farmers is already a crisis. They're already becoming more and more powerful. More and more impoverished, more and more vulnerable. So I think that's quite an important point to make, and that is going to, not everyone starts from the same starting point. Now, just jumping back a little bit before jumping across, there are, as we've seen, there are multiple crises unfolding within Kalavapatana, the dry zone, I mean, across rural Sri Lanka and across much of the world. And so these are really important crises and we need to act, but at the same time for kind of critical social scientists, particularly we need to also take a step back, not to say we need to take a step back and try and understand actually what is the language of crises doing. And it's something that's very depoliticizing in many ways. So the climate crisis, economic crisis, food security crisis, water crisis, these are very real material crises that have material impacts. But the kind of crisis language can also be used to trigger the kind of techno-managerial fixes that in practice actually risk undermining the very resilience of small scale, of social groups to which the interventions try to support. So I mean, if we think again about like food security crisis, I mean, that might mean signing a free trade deal where we're able to import food into Sri Lanka, which would then drop the price of paddy. So what is it? So it's kind of a contradiction. So what does it actually do in practice? Or along those lines. And then the other thing to think about in practice as well is that climate change response interventions, policies, again, are never neutral. I mean, I often have some quite infuriating conversations with a number, I don't want to name the organisations, but a number of development organisations who said, well, no, this benefits everyone the same, these are not political interventions. But in practice, benefits through any policy or project filter down through certain politics of vertical and horizontal affiliation. So there will be certain, for example, this concept of a model farmer that a number of climate change projects are trying to promote, where they're seen as good farmers and they will then be able to if they're given fertiliser, the sprinkler system, a number of other benefits, direct benefits through the project, they will implement them, and other farmers will see what they're doing and think, oh, I'll do that, even though, I can't afford it, but and so there is this, when you kind of dig into these relationships a bit further, I mean, they're often quite cozy connections, and so that's the other kind of point that I want to make. And so through this kind of politics affiliation, climate change interventions themselves reproduce social political power hierarchies. Now, I think we've got two more slides. Yes, 2 more slides. Cool. Now, this is probably a little bit brief, but I want to, and I think the work that Monlar's doing, Livia Campesina, for example, deserve far more attention than one slide. But I was just a bit conscious of time and trying to fit everything in. So I just want to briefly touch on some of the work here. And I want to start, there's a quote here by an excellent political ecologist called Marcus Taylor, who says this: the capitalism has furnished a socio-ecological environment that is deeply conducive to the systematic exclusion of cost. And he goes on to say, in this respect, industrial agriculture is predicated upon the continued spatial and temporal displacement of its core contradictions in a way that creates a sustainability of unsustainability. So what he kind of means by that is this kind of temporal and spatial exclusion of the cost. So there are costs, but we'll save the people 20 years down the line. And how can we kind of, and this idea of the sustainability of unsustainability is how can, he's at that time criticizing the kind of technical fixes. Say, again, I use the example, often if a time was doing hybrid seeds, still require a certain kind of chemical fertilizing pesticides, which are then being overused, and are producing soil infertility. But to kind of, to handle it, to be able to deal with soil infertility, rather than kind of taking a step back and looking at the mode of agriculture, let's just produce more and more kind of technological advancements to be able to keep on producing without kind of changing the political economic status quo. So the work of Monlar, I just want to kind of read out their objectives of what they do, is that they, so Monlar, again, movement on land and agricultural reform, is they look to push things around land redistribution and tenure rights, agrarian reform, regenerative agriculture, agroecology, food sovereignty, social justice, environmental sustainability, and urbanization. And I mean, to me, these things are not about responding to kind of climate change alone, they're not about responding to kind of economic crisis alone, they're about responding more broadly to some of the kind of, I say agrarian climate politics, but like about responding to kind of the concerns of justice, basically, and how can we create more just futures for small-scale farmers. And so I think that's really important. I mean, the idea of food sovereignty, so emphasizing the rights of individuals, communities, and countries to control their own food systems, and seeks to challenge the corporate control over agriculture to support local food production, distribution, and consumption. And then agroecology, again, it's a movement that promotes sustainable agricultural practices that prioritize ecological balance, biodiversity conservation, well-being of farmers and communities, and eradicates the reliance on chemical inputs, protects soil health, promotes resilience and diverse food systems. And so I think these are, like, what I would say is that approaching these things, we also can't see them as like a silver bullet on their own. They're not going to fix everything on their own, but what they fundamentally do is they look at reducing some of the risks that small-scale farmers do. So whether agroecology is going to be sufficient within 10 or 15 years to respond to climate change, that's a question that we don't know, obviously. But what it does do by promoting, more traditional seeds that you can kind of reproduce the next year, so you can kind of keep a portion after the harvest and harvest the next year, and it basically reduces the reliance on the market. Now, if there's a crop failure and you don't have as much of a debt, you reduce some of the risk. Like, it's still not going to be a good outcome, but it starts to reduce some of the risk and some of the uncertainties as well. And I mean, for an example, one of the farmers that I had been producing traditional varieties of paddy for about 10 years now. Now he had said, like, during the fertiliser bans, obviously he wasn't impacted because for the traditional paddy that he was growing, he didn't use chemical fertiliser, so he wasn't really impacted much by that. But what his story was that he can't quite possibly produce as much paddy every season as what he was doing, but his production costs have gone from tens of thousands of rupees per acre for fertiliser and pesticides to now 20,000 rupees per acre for land preparation. So while maybe producing less, he's still able to make more of a profit. There's still a better, it's essentially got less costs. Now, obviously this is still a very political question, because you then have broader concerns around like the nation's food security and producing food. So I want to be careful not to like over-romanticize these things. I mean, I know if I talk to any farmers in Kalawapatana, if you said you should go back to doing traditional farming and not using tractors, they will tell you to kind of get out of the village as soon as possible. I mean, so we have to be, again, like cautious of not over-romanticizing these things, but kind of, I think the work that Monla are doing provide like a tangible example, and I think they're also quite realistic that like not everything is perfect, and it's not like a model that should be, you can't have a model in one village and replicate it everywhere, but it's a different approach which kind of opens up a tangible kind of alternative that reduces some of the risks for agrarian societies to climate change, also to other kind of more political economic configuration. So yeah, I'm going to move on quickly just to the last slide, and just a couple of points that I wanted to make here. So again, a little bit ramble, but the idea that I'm trying to push towards, and I was really inspired by a lot of the work from SSA, is how can we kind of think about, obviously a regressive agrarian politics, but what about an agrarian, for me, I'm interested in how can we think about an progressive agrarian climate politics. And so a progressive climate politics would be something that looks at the social dynamics that again shape the meaning of climate change, its causes, consequences, how it can be addressed by whom, when, where, in ways that advance concerns of agrarian justice and climate justice. That essentially, I would say, again, perhaps can't be reduced to each other, but are now increasingly inseparable to each other. And also, thinking about agrarian questions of nature, whereby climate change and climate politics, and that means not just biophysical climate change, but discourses of climate change, climate financing, climate change projects are also kind of at the core to kind of contemporary agrarian transformations and rural transformations going on. And I'm just going to read out a couple of things to finish, and thank you so much for your patience while I make my way through and try to figure out some thoughts as I go. But I said at the start, one of the issues we see as political ecologists of the kind of mainstream approaches to climate change is, again, this externalization of climate change and rendering it as a problem that can be solved. And so I just wanted to finish on some thoughts about how we're moving forward beyond that, so beyond conceptualizing climate change as a problem, to thinking about it more as a condition. And I'm just going to quote my supervisor here, if you don't mind, Eric Swingerdale, who says, "If we deeply care about climate and other social environmental conditions, our theoretical gaze and political passions have to shift from a concern of the environment per se to a concern and passion for construction of a different kind of politics." Okay, and so kind of to do so, again, I think would like to kind of, as we move forward, or as I move forward a bit with this as well, but hopefully as some of us move forward, kind of challenge the notion of climate change as a problem that society must deal with, and instead argue that of thinking about it as a condition. And so as a problem, climate change kind of lends itself to the idea that that requires the right kind of technical managerial solutions. So again, drought requires climate resilient hybrid seeds and so on and so on. And this really ensures that nothing really changes. The status quo continues as it is, albeit it's now climate resilient. So in the case of Kalawapatana and Silva Kulama illustrate, the current socio-ecological conditions is already a crisis that threatens their futures. And so I hope that I've demonstrated the climate crisis does not act as like a singular independent crisis. It cannot be distilled or kind of isolated. It cannot be reduced to a separate technical sphere that threatens agrarian lives from the outside. And so I would kind of, to summarize, to finish up, would say that if we think of climate change as a condition of agrarian life, it can help us shift our analytical gaze away from responding to climate change alone towards a more political conversation about the possibility, about possible and desirable climate change agrarian futures. So I'm going to leave that there. If anyone, thank you so much again. I probably went through that a bit fast in some areas, so if there are any questions about certain things you'd like me to clarify, I'd be happy to. And again, thank you for the opportunity to share some of my incoherent thoughts with the wider audience. So thank you so much.